Let's talk about justice, especially climate justice. Among other things, Climate Crisis 101 approaches the climate crisis as a social justice issue. This approach is generally referred to as climate justice. In a certain way, the methodological approach used in Climate Crisis 101 is similar to seeing racism as something that is baked into American culture and lamentably has been ever since and even before our country was founded by a group of privileged white men. As far as I can tell, one of the reasons that people seem to resist this obvious truth regarding race in the U.S. is because it tarnishes the idea of the United States for them. In other words, for people who believe, and often loudly proclaim, that the United States is a great country, this is a thorn in their sides because it draws attention to the fact that the U.S. once enslaved and to this day grossly mistreats and even still unjustly kills on a daily basis Black Americans. Indeed, the United States is in a variety of ways unjust to most Americans, including but not limited to women, people of color, and the LGBTQ plus community. Hence, if the United States hopes to one day become a great country, it obviously never truly has been one, it will need a great deal of reform. You can see why, to some people who believe that America is overwhelmingly a great country, or at least was until relatively recently, and hence believe that they can make America great again with the right leadership, this could be a deeply unsettling thought. However, to be clear, this does not mean that we need to turn our back on our country. To the contrary, in order to address the injustices and suffering, we really need to roll up our sleeves and make this, for the first time, a truly great country, which, personally, I believe that it can one day become. Similarly, for people who believe the United States is and has been an overwhelmingly great country, the climate crisis may be unsettling. There are nearly 200 sovereign states, by that I mean countries on the planet. Of all these, one country has contributed more to the climate crisis than any other, by a long shot. When approached from the perspective of population, this relatively tiny country, which has just 4% of the Earth's population, has been responsible for 25% of historical greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions. Incidentally, this was largely done in the past 60 years. In contrast, the poorest 3 billion people on Earth have contributed only 5% of GHG emissions. Ironically, because this country amassed so much wealth through its fossil fuel economy, it will likely suffer far less than most countries. Who will suffer the consequences of climate change the most? Those poorest 3 billion people who did virtually nothing to bring about this crisis. This is obviously a deeply unjust state of affairs. Expressed another way, this is an enormous climate justice problem. So, which country committed this almost unimaginable crime against our planet and billions of its people? You know the answer. Though it is difficult for us in the U.S. to come to grips with what we have done. Approached from the perspective of the climate crisis, not only isn't the U.S. the greatest country, it is the absolute worst by a long shot. If you were not already mortified to be a U.S. citizen because of our history of societal racism and other acts of systemic injustice, climate justice gives you yet another compelling reason to feel, ashamed. It's also a reason to stop and reflect on what the fossil fuel economy has given us, extraordinary wealth and privilege, which has come at an even more extraordinary cost. Incidentally, issues like societal racism and climate justice are often deeply intertwined, sometimes really deeply so. This might be easiest to see with the related issue of environmental justice. When new facilities that will pollute the environment, such as a chemical factory or a power plant, are planned, where do you think they're located? In posh white neighborhoods or poor Black ones? In the United States, it has historically been the latter, which means that people in these neighborhoods, as well as their land and their groundwater, are often exposed to toxic substances. All sorts of marginalized individuals and communities can be impacted by environmental justice issues. For example, women are at a greater risk of being harmed as being exposed to toxic materials can threaten their reproductive health. So returning to climate justice, which is concerned with the impact of climate change across the planet rather than just point source pollution that can come from a factory or power plant, issues like race clearly come into play. Although racial diversity in the U.S. has been improving in recent decades, when I was born, 1959, roughly 90% of Americans were white. And those poorest 3 billion people on Earth, overwhelmingly, most are people of color. The climate crisis presents a challenge for individuals who have been led to believe that the United States is an overwhelmingly great country. For people my age and older, it can be especially difficult to come to grips with the crisis, as most of the GHG emissions in the Earth's atmosphere from the United States happen during our watch. This can lead to denial, deep denial. When we think about climate change denial, we often, naturally enough, think about the fossil fuel companies wanting to deny the validity of the crisis so that they can continue to make a profit. In this case, we now know that executives at companies like Exxon have known about the truth that the impact that fossil fuels were having on climate change for more than 4 decades. However, there are many types of climate change denial. Perhaps one of the strongest forms of denial does not come from people who know the truth but publicly deny it, but rather from individuals who deep down just can't come to grips with the truth. Some people in the U.S. who want nothing more to be proud to be an American are deeply in denial, desperately wanting to convince themselves, as well as other groups, that the climate crisis isn't real. After all, admitting so would also necessitate abandoning the thought that we are the greatest country on Earth in order to accept the fact that, when it comes to anthropogenic climate change, we're the worst country on Earth and to the Earth. Consequently, such individuals can have an incredible personal investment in denying the truth of the climate crisis to themselves and anyone willing to listen. And make no mistake, this issue can really hit home. The carbon footprint for the average American is 35 times greater than the average person in Bangladesh. Unfortunately, Bangladesh, which is a poor country, will be disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, as 40% of the country will be lost with just 2 feet of sea level rise, an amount that will occur in the next few upcoming decades. Since Bangladesh did very little to contribute to climate change, this is an obvious climate justice issue of staggering proportions. If this were not bad enough, the so-called American dream, to which we are encouraged to aspire, and some people believe they have, in various ways, actually achieved, is a climate nightmare of unbridled consumption, hardly a dream. Big houses, big cars, and lots of them, boundless air travel, an endless supply of stuff delivered right to our doors. The list goes on and on. People who come closest to realizing the dream, the A-listers, may have a carbon footprint many times larger than the average American. For example, traveling in a private jet emits 40 times as much carbon per passenger as regular commercial flights. Hence, in its supersized form, a single person living the dream, the American dream in the U.S., is likely producing more greenhouse gas emissions than an entire village of hundreds of people in Bangladesh. In other words, from a climate and climate justice perspective, the belief that the U.S. is an overwhelmingly great country could not be more wrong. And with respect to the, American dream, it is, to the contrary, a climate nightmare. As with systemic racism and a host of other social justice issues, it falls to the current generation to undo the injustices of the past. Again, this is not to say that we need to turn our back on our country. To the contrary, I would argue that the U.S. has never needed us more. If we bravely confront the past and then roll up our sleeves to do what we can to right the injustices of all this, the United States and the Earth will greatly benefit.